stim noi, im remur tremoșești. Cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Hello.
Hello and greetings, everybody. We are currently live to the magnificent masses, and we are currently broadcasting to you across the mediums of YouTube, the Decline and Fall Substack page, which you really should subscribe to if you haven't done so already. Lots of exciting things coming up there, including potential investigations into show favourite Paul Mason. And I would urge all of you also to check out the back catalogue, because we're going to be diving into that soon to cover our summer break, where you can find interesting things such as an expose of the nature of a certain Carol Cadwallader, who is currently trying to reinvent herself as some sort of bold anti-fascist hero, when in reality she's a paid hack for, amongst others, Pierre Omidyar, and of course our beloved friends in the 77th Brigade, who I know are listening right now. So hello, chaps. We do not appreciate your service. Joining me from the once and future Socialist Yugoslavia, and appropriately dressed in red in order to draw the ire of Daily Telegraph commentators who feature in our Media Twat segments. By the way, more Media Twat segments will appear in the near future, because fucking hell, there are a plethora of pond life and scum that we could feature, and that's just from the Daily Telegraph editorial pages. When we spread the net out even further, Jesus Christ, there's a lot to choose from. And we know we promised you Americans a while ago an extended American Media Twat special, but the truth is there were just too many to choose from, but we will be returning to that. But here he is, live from the once and future Socialist Yugoslavia, Kit Clarenberg. How does the day find you today, sir?
Very well. I've managed to erect some kind of air conditioning system in my bunker, so I'm slightly less frazzled than usual. But which is certainly not a comment on the temperature of the show that we've got in store for you today, because it might be summer and it might be the silly season, but boy, are a lot of not silly things, indeed deeply serious things, including yet further installments in the never-ending decline and fall of the Anglo-American global empire. Let's get to it, Alex.
Yes, indeed. So we will begin this week with a look into an internal element of the decline and fall of the Anglo-American Empire, and this is very much on the Anglo side of things. Of course, there will be lessons from this that can be drawn by our American friends, and that is what is known as the Spycops Enquiry. Now, that is a reference to the activities of various different police units within Britain, or I should say more specifically within England and Wales, because the inquiry into the espionage activities of the unit known as the Special Demonstration Squad and its successor organisation, the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, this is focused on their activities in England and Wales. Now, what this refers to is the over 1,000 political groups that have been systematically infiltrated by undercover agents. So not informants, though that certainly was a thing, not surveillance, though that certainly wasn't a thing, but undercover agents of the traditional sort, who have been sent in. These are serving police officers sent into left-wing organizations, anarchist organizations, trade unions to carry out surveillance, but also subversion, and engaging in various different behaviors that could be described as, shall we say, sexually abusive, such as tricking women into long-term relationships and then having children with them and promptly disappearing. And these women finding out years later that the man that they had been called their husband for a while turned out to have been somebody else entirely, in fact, a police officer. And this came to light a number of years ago after a number of women campaigned for justice for what they had been through. And eventually it was revealed that the Metropolitan Police and the Association of Chief Police Officers had been coordinating a systematic penetration of like the organized left across Britain. And this, again, this is rather frankly admitted to by a friend of the show, Stella Rimington, in her book, where she covers her time as an MI5 desk officer, supervising the sending of agents and the espionage on the Socialist Workers' Party, the Militant Tendency, and others in the 1970s and 1980s. So this is admitted to by those in power. So this inquiry was set up in order to, well, supposedly get to the truth of it. In reality, to carry out a very long, drawn-out process, which bored everybody to death in order that the truth could be buried. But, Kit, this has actually, if you're prepared to suffer through the daily briefings on this, revealed an awful lot about how the British state actually operates and what kind of democracy actually exists in perfidious Albion, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I must stress it's quite a personal thing for me because I know a great many people, including friends, comrades, fellow activists, dating back pretty much 20 years, who themselves ended up on the receiving end of Spycops, whether they were in deceived into romantic relations by undercover police, whether they were in groups where someone who they thought was a good friend of theirs was a spy cop. And I remember very well the scandal breaking. It was kind of around late 2010, early 2011. Was when this erupted, and it's just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And I mean, there's all sorts of different components to the scandal, and we've been hoping to get Tom Fowler, who is a victim himself, a pretty egregious victim of state spying. He was based in a Cardiff activist group. We've been hoping to get him on the show, and that invitation very much remains open, Tom, if you are listening. But yeah, I mean, it's so vast, and it's just carried on. It's carried on going. Now, I remember as a concerned citizen and also an independent journalist at the time, I started following the undercover policing inquiry back when it was launched back in, I believe it was 2015, by Theresa May, who was then, the Home Secretary, and indeed, one of perhaps the worst Home Secretary in history. And I was outside I believe it was the Royal Courts of Justice in London, and I was speaking to the son of Pat Finucane, who is a lawyer in Belfast who was killed by British intelligence supported loyalist paramilitaries with the direct assistance of the British state. And I was discussing how long he thought the process was going to last, because at that stage, the entire inquiry covering the activities of, yes, the Special Demonstration Squad, but also the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, was only meant to last 3 years. Finucane did not think that this was particularly realistic, and he said that in any event, I mean, this is just the first inquiry you're getting. By the second or third inquiry, and we're talking maybe 20, 30 years into the future, then we might start getting some proof of as they actually we might actually be getting close to the truth. To say the least, he's been somewhat vindicated. This is just carried on and on and on. It's only just begun hearing evidence on relatively recent events. Consistently, the the judges in charge, who, you know, they're establishment judges with histories of absolutely shocking rulings, very sexist, and, you know, they are having to adjudicate on the rights and wrongs of disclosing to women deceived into long-term relationships by undercover police whether they can know the real names of the men who effectively raped them. You know, let's call it what it is. So yeah, there's been an enormous amount of obfuscation, obstruction. The police have done everything to drag their heels on this. It must be stressed as well that this only covers England and Wales. Many known spy cops had activities in Scotland. It is inconceivable that there wasn't a dedicated Scottish spy cops unit. You know, with no prizes for guessing the kind of groups and individuals who they were spying on, seeking to subvert. Well, Scottish independence, probably very obvious prospect. And there have been attempts by activists to compel the Scottish government to hold their own UCPI, and that's failed. The process has ground on so long now that there is a move by the state to shut down the inquiry because they say it's costing too much money and it's taking too long. And, you know, we're not even into the 2000s really in terms of, you know, learning what was about what was heard. Many police officers, including, you know, senior officers, have testified under oath, many of them anonymously. They seem to have very bad memories. There have been some pretty astonishing justifications from police on, you know, who are about their deployments. There was one, I believe this was at the when things kicked off in around 2020. There was one officer, nameless of course, who infiltrated left-wing groups in the 60s and 70s and admitted to having sexual relations with activists under his undercover identity. And he said it was no different than an undercover drugs cop sticking his finger in a bag of powder and tasting it. You know, that was the analogy that he used for justifying why it was okay to you know, sleep with women without their informed consent. You know, really shocking stuff. And it just, yeah, I mean, this should be, you know, a major national ongoing scandal. I mean, it's absolutely historic. It's like COINTELPRO in the you know, in during the Cold War in the US, but it's not really been on the mainstream radar. Particularly the Guardian, to its kind of minimal credit, has actually done some good work on this, and that's mainly, you know, Rob Evans is, you know, pushing that. And in most recently, there was a absolutely extraordinary disclosure in the UCPI that John Butcher, who was a senior police officer who took over the running of the Special Demonstration Squad, SDS, we'll call it from now on, that within months of his appointment, I believe this was in 2007, 2008, which is, right when it gets shut down, he concluded that it was conducting unjustified surveillance, that it was incredibly badly run, that it was basically a boys' club comprised of people who basically did whatever they wanted, claimed, got paid enormous amounts of money for what they were doing, consistently claimed overtime, and were effectively, in many cases, getting paid to just sit around with hippies and take drugs at festivals. That was their job, and they were making a lot of money doing this, shockingly. But a very, very striking excerpt of a statement from Butcher that was read out during the UCPI, which the Guardian did catch, although it didn't necessarily emphasize it didn't delve into why this is so shocking, but also somehow kind of unsurprising, is the fact that the SDS, it was constantly justifying its own existence on the basis of exaggerations and lies. And Butcher specifically said that their tales of SDS successes, when they were talking about why it was so important to spend so much money maintaining this dedicated unit to infiltrate largely harmless left-wing groups who would leaflet in town centres at a weekend, but they were seen as a major threat to the state, and actually arguably in many ways they were. This was just fairy tales, like quote unquote fairy tales. I myself, having followed this for a very long time, I was not particularly surprised by that revelation because, I mean, number one, knowing a lot of activists who were affected by this, they themselves would have been the first to state, well, you know, we were a bunch of students. Sometimes we wouldn't get up on time to catch the bus to get to a protest. You know, we weren't a threat to anyone. We didn't think that we were important enough to be spied on. And I think, you know, that's something for everyone who's involved in even the tamest political activity to reflect on. You're never too small for the state to consider you problematic and subject you to surveillance and harassment and all manner of other punitive measures, but also just the fact that in many cases, what these spy cops were doing was they were encouraging and facilitating, in many cases, the protest actions and protest movements that they were sent to spy on. And in some cases, this took the form of straight up entrapment, where there were, you know, spy cops would encourage the people they were spying on to, you know, burn down buildings or you know, invest in guns, learn how to make explosives, and you know, and this, that, and the rest of it. And you know, in some cases, I believe, you know, Palestine solidarity activists who were spied on back in the 80s and 90s got fitted up in this manner. You know, very common you know, MI5 FBI tactic. You find someone vulnerable and suggestible and push them to commit crimes, and then you bust that crime and claim that you're under threat. But I mean, if you go back to the early 90s, this was with the fall of the Soviet Union and the you know, the by and large cessation of violent tension in occupied Ireland. Britain's intelligence apparatus was stuck for a raison d'etre. They didn't really have very much to do. There wasn't a threat within or without for them to justify their existence and budgets. And there was actually discussion about the prospect of MI5 taking over responsibility for monitoring the drugs trade, for example, because they were absolutely desperate. Now, right around this time, a large number of spy cops appear in the animal rights movement. They are usually very willing to assist financially with the operation of these groups. They always have vans. You know, they're trained police drivers. So they're, you know, they were very happy to ferry people to and from protest movements. So in a sense, they were creating the very threat, quote unquote, that their existence depended on. And, you know, we can think of so many other examples throughout history that this has happened. But yeah, like, you got to understand, like, how pointless and excessive and wanton this was. That's not at all to underestimate how immoral and actually, quite frankly, evil what these people were doing were at all. But you know, I think it's something to be, you know, very careful about now. You know, we have this, you know, we have rising levels of political dysfunction and political dissent in the UK, and as you know, we've discussed many times, and you can see with your own eyes on social media and even the mainstream media, we've reached a point where grandmothers holding cardboard signs saying they oppose genocide are getting arrested as terrorists. So the dragnet in terms of people who are viewed as even a potential threat has gotten much broader. In you know, what legislative developments there have been in terms of the functions of the security, intelligence, and you know, and police apparatus in this country has been to grant them more powers, particularly to commit crimes. There was a few years back controversy over the covert human information source (CHIS) bill, which enshrined in law the ability of undercover officers of MI5 and Special Branch and MI6, but also agents, including, you know, agents as young as 16, to commit crimes including rape and murder. And you know, we don't have to use our imaginations to wonder why they are being given these powers. But yeah, there's been no attempt to rein in Britain's secret state at all, you know, whether formally or informally. And you know, as even the head of the committee, which is meant to oversee and vet the work of Britain's intelligence agencies, says that billions in public money is being spent on spying activities without any oversight whatsoever. So I think these are all things to bear in mind. The Spycops scandal might be historic by this stage, but it's gone nowhere.
Yes, indeed. In fact, if you look at the covert human information sources factors that you've just been talking about, and the various terrorism and national security bills that have been passed, all the stuff that the spy cops did, including pursuing relationships under false pretenses and other even more shady things, all of that has actually been institutionalized now. It's been legalized. So, like, even if they did it now, could all be justified under national security bills that have been passed by successive governments, both Tory and Labour. And the thing is, like, even for people who are liberals, like this, it should be something that is concerning, but it's not, because what the intelligence services do, as Kit implied in his description of events there, is that they invent various different threats to justify their budgets, justify their powers, etc. So we go from, in the 1990s, the justification for the first extension of like the anti-terrorism powers was the Animal Liberation Front. And I remember this very clearly. I remember, because I was 17 when this first started to be discussed. That's a while ago now. But I remember Jack Straw, if anybody remembers him, going on TV and saying the dire threat posed by the Animal Liberation Front. Bear in mind, the Animal Liberation Front had done what? Break into some laboratories and send some letter bombs. That was it. And by the way, we don't even know if those letter bombs were actually sent by legitimate animal rights activists or were done under the influence of a fucking spy cop. And if you're American and this sounds very familiar, this is exactly what the FBI does, by the way. The FBI, again, not speculation, they were done for this, was going into mosques in the 2000s, finding somebody who was essentially crazy or mentally unwell in some way or developmentally disabled and saying, hey, brother, want to strike back against the infidels? I know how. And literally like creating a terrorist act out of nothing. Same way they do with the so-called right-wing militia movement in the United States. That's under federal control, by the way. Everybody should read a book by an American academic called Dr. Wendy Painting on the Oklahoma City bombing, where essentially she dives into the military biography of Timothy McVeigh and finds out that this guy was just a undercover military intelligence asset who was likely stitched up for the bombing and that was actually carried out by somebody else who was also probably a military intelligence asset. But that's an aside. But when you look at the pattern of behavior, both in Britain, occupied Ireland, and in the United States as well, you can see that these agencies, well, they are exactly as Joseph Conrad wrote about in the book The Secret Agent, where the supposed anarchist mastermind, Mr. Verloc, sets up his mentally unwell brother-in-law to carry out like a suicide bombing in the Royal Observatory, in order that on the commands of like his special branch handlers. And that's a book from 1907. So things haven't really changed for many, 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 many decades. And the Spycops Enquiry reveals that exactly the same tactics are pursued, which is that they bureaucratically create the problems and then step in and claim to have the solutions, which are always more restrictions on democratic rights, more powers for the security services, and more ability to throw people in jail based on little or no evidence. So again, not exactly a surprise that this would be their preferred tactic, but certainly something that should be kept an eye on. Now, the other things to mention when it comes to the Spycops Enquiry is that, of course, they're trying to shut this down at the moment because the problem for the state is that they still want to use these tactics. They still want to use undercover cops. They still want to use agents in organizations that will act as provocateurs. And it brings up certain interesting questions for anybody who's trying to organize on the left, exactly how this should be responded to. And the other point I wanted to make before handing back over to Kit for further comment was that the issue of infiltration of the trade unions came up, and one former Spycop commander was questioned about this, and he said that, oh well, we didn't go after legitimate trade unionism, just those who could be seen as a threat to the state. Now, the issue about that is that, and no one followed him up with the obvious follow up question, which is, when was it decided that trade unionism becomes a threat to the state? When does an industrial dispute get judged to be then a threat to national security? At what point is that line crossed? And my issue, the issue I would have raised was that line is judged to be crossed if an industrial dispute goes on long enough in an important enough industry and sees working class people get politicized. That is probably the free judgment points that are used by the state to judge whether something is a legitimate industrial dispute or not. They probably don't intervene in like tiny localized ones, but anything which is national, any trade union with the potential to shut down the country. So back in the old days, we know, thanks to the work of Seamus Milne, that they comprehensively infiltrated the higher levels of the National Union of Mine Workers, including their chief accountant, Roger Windsor, who was a British state asset and who may also have been a CIA asset at some point in his miserable career. We know that they will have people within, like, the rail workers unions, within the big unions like Unite with a heavy private sector membership. All of these will be comprehensively infiltrated right now. So Spycops isn't historical, it's real and current, and everything they've done has been retrospectively justified and worked into legislation. So what you're viewing now is not a historical confession, it's the actual practice of the British state before, during, and after the Cold War. And it is only going to get worse as the legitimacy of all of the Western powers in the eyes of their own population continues to decline. Did you have anything you wanted to add in, Kit?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, several points made that, and I'm sorry that my computer randomly just died mid-sentence, and I'm sure that's just a coincidence and some ghosts in the machine rather than related to the content of our conversation. But yeah, I think that the union point is really worth driving home. Because number one, you got to bear in mind that for decades, trade unions have been, just as a matter of policy, been heavily infiltrated by the state, not just by Spycops, but by different spying agencies, dedicated units like IRIS, which was the Industrial Relations Intelligence Section, and that had worked heavily with Information Research Department, which was this Cold War era black propaganda unit run by MI5 and MI6, but also as well that the point goes even deeper. Beyond trade unions, there was a significant focus within the Spycop scandal on just workers in general from in every field. For many years, there was an organization called the Consulting Association, which is, a typically kind of anodyne and Orwellian euphemistic name. And this was effectively a front company where the intelligence services worked with big business to create blacklists of potential troublemakers. So intelligence that was sourced by MI5 or Spycops on the presence of particular people at protests or engaged in political action would be handed to the Consulting Association, and then an employer would get in, usually construction and industry, but also other fields as well, including teaching. They would get on the phone to the consulting association and say, this person has applied for work. Do you have anything on them? And in the construction context, it would be like, well, okay, so this guy who's a bricklayer also attends Palestine solidarity matches, right? He's not getting work. This teacher is a bit, a known troublemaker who was part of his local communist party when he was a student, right? Okay, so they're not getting employed by in a particular field or by a particular school or university. And that is a absolutely massive scandal that's been rather forgotten now. There is a fantastic book, I think it's just called Blacklist, which is features heavy contributions from Dave Smith, who is a trade unionist himself, was blacklisted, runs the Blacklist support group. But that scratches the surface of something far, far deeper. We know from police disclosures that they maintain dedicated, what they call industrial intelligence units, that coordinate with employers and keep an eye on people in a variety of professions, not just public sector at all. The effects of blacklisting can be absolutely devastating. We're talking about people being informally barred from working. There was one victim of this who I spoke to who compared it to a form of house arrest. Really horrendous, horrendous stuff, which the UCPI has not really gone near by design. And I think as well that on the subject of whether people are threats or not, the amount of contradictions around this that have arisen through the UCPI is pretty extraordinary. So, number one, if you look at the list of groups that were targeted, it was by the Spycops over decades, it was almost universally left-wing progressive factions, of every size, of every potency, of whatever their cause. It was literally 99.9% left-wing groups. Now, the justification for this, old and new, and there were old Spycops files dug up by the inquiry, written by senior officials within the SDS who openly said this, is, well, we can't have our officers infiltrating right-wing groups because they're violent and dangerous, but we have to infiltrate left-wing groups because they're really dangerous. So, that is a total contradiction in terms. But it goes even deeper than this, that there was a particularly notorious Spycop called Andy Coles, who for many years infiltrated anti-war, animal rights, hunt saboteur groups in South London. He was an absolutely notorious predatory creep who attempted to force himself sexually on a number of female activists without very much success, although he did deceive a young lady who was half his age into a long-term relationship, which he strenuously denies to this day. He became a Conservative councillor for Peterborough and a deputy police and crime commissioner for Cambridgeshire more widely. He has expressed, absolutely zero contrition. He himself sticks to the line that the groups that he was infiltrating were extremely violent and extremely dangerous, and a major threat to the state, by sabotaging fox hunts, etc. And there are some amazing clips of him. He recently testified at the UCPI, and there's a number of clips of him squirming under cross-examination by the Spycop victim's lawyer, where he a question is specifically put to him, for example, that his leaving do is very common for Spycops to have leaving do's because they had dedicated extraction stories, and I'm moving away for work, or blah, I want to start a family elsewhere in the country, so I've got to leave. And it was noted that his leaving do was very poorly attended, and it was put to him that this was because he was a known sexual predator or attempted sexual predator, and he gave some mumbling denial. Now, Coles is a very interesting character, not only because of his absolutely horrendous record while he was undercover, but also because after his deployment, he became a very influential figure within the SDS and was kind of in a managerial position, to the extent that he wrote the SDS Tradecraft Manual. Now, this is a 44-page guide to for prospective spy cops on how they should and shouldn't act, and it is completely rife with absolutely vile comments. It's clear that he had a massive amount of contempt for the people that he was spying on, as did all the spy cops. He Coles throughout this guide refers to the victims of British police spying as wearies, because they are very, very wearying to be around from his perspective, and all sorts of comments about how they eat food that you wouldn't give to a dog, and blah blah blah. But there is also a dedicated section on relationships with undercovers. And Cole says, it may be unavoidable, engaging in, sexual activity with female activists, and otherwise people might think that you're gay, amongst other, pretty appalling excerpts. The Special Branch Files Project has a annotated version of the Tradecraft Manual. I would urge people to go over it, because it's a very interesting insight into the mindset of the kind of scumbags who were involved in this from section 68 to 2008, when it gets shut down. And it offers it offers advice on how to infiltrate groups. It's very, very detailed, and also the versions that have been released are pretty heavily redacted. There are also supplementary guides to undercover spying produced by the SDS, which contain some pretty disturbing sections, including there's one document which explicitly states you will feel a lot of stress undercover, but stress is actually a good thing, and it can contribute to heightened awareness and improve your spying capabilities. While it's difficult to feel much sympathy for the people who were involved in spying on innocent people, for many cases, in most cases, in very intimate ways, over the span of many years, you have people like Peter Francis, who was a very early whistleblower, a former SDS operative who, under the pseudonym P. Black, infiltrated racial justice groups and indeed spied on the grieving family of Stephen Lawrence in the wake of his racially motivated murder in 1994. He suffers intense PTSD to this day, to the extent that sometimes he wakes up and thinks that he's Pete Black again. So, I mean, the ravaging psychological and emotional impact that this had on at least some of the officers themselves is, pretty substantial. And there has been zero indication that any lessons have been learned from this, that safeguards will be in place to ensure that there's no psychological or emotional damage inflicted on the people doing this. So again, we should, what we have learned from the inquiry, well, just assume that it's entirely applicable to the present day.
Well, indeed, and just to add on the blacklisting question, I met several blacklisted electricians, must be about 15 years ago now, who were still picketing employers such as Balfour Beatty, the construction giant, who used the Consulting Association's files. And one of the elements of this, which hasn't been mentioned because it's probably not part of the inquiry's remit, is the fact that the other side of the blacklisting of trade unionists, aside from the cops and aside from the Consulting Association, was corrupt trade union officials. Corrupt trade union officials in what was once called the Amalgamated Electricians and Engineers Union, a very right-wing union, well, a union with a very right-wing leadership, but what at one time had a very militant base of trade union stewards within it who had the kind of like political knowledge and authority on sites to lead spontaneous walkouts. And you still get quite a lot of spontaneous walkouts in the building trade to this day. And it was those guys who were targeted for the blacklisting. And it was the trade union officials who were collaborating long term with the police and with the consulting association to make sure that militant shop stewards did not get work. And like I knew guys who were blacklisted for years, and where information turned up in their police and consulting association files that had to have come from trade union officials. So let's be absolutely clear. It's the cops do this, and it's their job to do it. That's the purpose of the state forces. But they're in partnership with right-wing trade union officials who are as committed to the elimination of working class militancy as the state is. And that's why there's so many ex-trade union leaders in the House of Lords. It's why there's so many of them are sirs, just like Sir Keir Starmer. And it's why so many of them have like OBEs, MBEs, etc. Because their job to police the working class movement as much as it's the cops' job to police it. And without them, a lot of this shit would not be possible. Now, I wanted to segue here, and I'm just going to put a link in the chat for sort of a segue to our next segment here, which is linked to the Spycops stuff, which is that one of the revelations that comes out of the Spycops Enquiry is that the way they infiltrated a lot of left-wing groups was to essentially turn up with an unlimited beer budget. And this is, again, not exactly a surprise to anybody who's been on the left in Britain or elsewhere, but certainly in the left in the perfidious Albion. Most of the meetings either take place in or end up in a public house of some variety or another. The methods of checking people out when they join largely don't exist, or it's like turned up, he's got a van, he seems keen, let's put him in charge of something, basically. He turned up, he bought a round, he said fuck the state, he wore a t-shirt saying fuck the Tories. Again, let's trust him. And this laxity, this lack of discipline, this lack of seriousness, and this culture of boozing and narcotics consumption is something I wrote about recently in a free-to-access article on my own Patreon page, which I've just posted in the chat there. And what I came to the conclusion regarding this, and regarding my own experiences on the British left over many years, was that this is the reason why this is so easy to infiltrate is because essentially a lot of the people who run it don't take this particularly seriously. They don't take their own actions particularly seriously, because if they did, they wouldn't be getting drunk after each meeting or during the meeting. They wouldn't be basing a lot of what they do in the pub. And the same is true for trade unionism as well. Like a lot of trade union discussions take place after like 8 pints. So when you think about it that way, it's no wonder cops find it rather easy to infiltrate. Because again, you turn up, you buy a couple of rounds, you listen to somebody's war stories, so to speak. You come up with a fictional background of your own, and you're in. So there's a lack of seriousness there. There is a lack of like the, shall we say, willingness to be disciplined. And there's the treating of organizations like by some people who are full-timers within them as if it was just like one long extended act of studentdom. Basically, it's a way for largely men in their 40s and 50s and older to still act as if they were 18 to 21, get drunk, try and sleep with the younger comrades, shall we say, and end up disgracing themselves in various different ways. Again, these are organizations which are very easy for intelligence agents to infiltrate, very easy to manipulate, very easy to destroy internally. Because, again, the British left these days is fundamentally an ill-disciplined, largely middle-class rabble that couldn't even get out of bed for its own demonstrations quite a lot of the time. So it recurs to me, and I don't claim that this is original thought, plenty of other people have gone down this road before, but it's really important now with whatever you're doing. If you're organizing in trade union terms, if you're organizing as a communist, that you really need to either junk drinking or narcotics consumption entirely, or have a rule that like you can't engage in it when you're on any kind of like party or trade union business, because it just makes it so easy for the spies to infiltrate and to influence. And if you can't, I mean, when I posted that article, one of the immediate responses was, Marx and Engels like to drink. It's like, well, we're not in 1864 anymore, you know? We've come on a long time from then. We've had a whole, like, a century and a half of experience since then. So we need to learn something. And the thing you need to learn is that if you're serious about what you're doing, then you need to give up things. So you need to give up living like a student. You need to give up like getting off your face and like, tweeting all your secrets out and stuff like that. You need to act in a more disciplined and organized fashion. And if you can't do that, or the suggestion of doing that makes you angry and resentful towards those who are saying it, well, then you're probably in the wrong game. Give it up. Go and do something else. Like stop acting as if this is some sort of playground, because as the Spycops Enquiry shows, the state's not playing around. You do anything to oppose them these days in a serious way, or is something that looks remotely serious, and they'll come down on you like a ton of bricks. So it requires a level of seriousness right back again. So, Kit, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to my sobriety rant there. You're muted, mate.
Wouldn't be an episode without our catchphrase. I would urge people to read Alex's essay on the importance of sobriety from a revolutionary perspective, and it has an excellent line in it which has stayed with me, which is sobriety must be promoted as a positive virtue, not the grim abstinence of the recovering addict, but the alert, disciplined consciousness of the revolutionary militant. And this is something with which I wholeheartedly agree on a personal and political level. It has been remarked upon by some of our viewers that I look and sound a lot better than I once did. I am 8 months sober at this stage, and I feel I've never felt so good. I have zero desire to ever, even have a sip of wine ever again, at this stage, and feel a lot better for it. I heartily recommend it. I have heartily recommended to friends of mine, activists, journalists, to avoid it, because I remember in my late teens and early 20s, when I was regularly attending protests, there was always a group of people who would be having strong lager before going on a march, and it's why. And then frequently, as Alex says, these actions would end with everyone in a pub. You've not really achieved very much, and then you're going to, give yourself brain damage and sit around talking rubbish for a few hours and achieve even less. It's not a good strategy if you actually want to achieve anything meaningful politically. And I might add as well that there are so many examples of spy cops who infiltrated groups, by and large, by turning up and offering to buy people drinks. There are over and over again this has happened. The spy cops abused those positions to deceive women into relationships, including women who were in relationships with other activists, therefore destroying activist groups. It's a well-known trait of various named spy cops. Powerbase has a series of very detailed profiles produced by the Undercover Research Group of known spy cops over and over again. The fact that they were willing to, if not, drink heavily or perhaps take drugs themselves, they certainly had the money to fund other people doing it. Ask yourself why that is. And just a similar kind of example of this in history. Kim Philby, the MI6 KGB double agent, one of the reasons that he was so effective was he would get high-ranking MI6 officials drunk, or even high-ranking CIA officials drunk, and they would their tongues would loosen, and they would say all sorts of things, which he would retain. And he was very good at acting like he was a lot drunker than he actually was. Perhaps he was even trained to do this. Perhaps Spycops themselves are trained to do this. For a variety of reasons, it is something to avoid. The fact that it's such a recurrent theme with known Spycops there. Marco Jacobs, who was a Spycop deployed for 5 years, 2004 to 2009, infiltrated groups in Wales, in Brighton, did a lot of damage to groups and indeed the individual members of them. He used to boast that his drug of choice was strong European lager. Do the maths.
Well, indeed, and the alcohol reliance is not a good thing anyway. But if you're trying to conduct some kind of serious business, then it's a positive hindrance. So I think for too long, a lot of people have regarded activism as something which is a lifestyle choice, and the state doesn't regard it that way, and therefore we shouldn't regard it that way either. And so everybody be sure to read that essay that I wrote. I welcome all comments, but if your main complaint is I like a drink, well, you should really ask yourself why. And the same goes for, by the way, narcotics consumption. Like the anarchists that I was involved with, how long ago now? 24 years ago. Like we're all constantly high. So you can't do anything when you're constantly out of it. You can't do anything serious anyway. You're easier to manipulate. Your reactions are slow. Like you can't think quickly. You can't react quickly. Like all of these things are snares, really promoted by the ruling class in order to pacify people. So if you're apparently organizing against those in power, then why would you want to slow down your reactions? There are other ways to unwind that don't involve dulling the senses. So, food for thought, quite literally there, everybody. And now we will pivot to, shall we say, further articles for consumption, which is, of course, our semi-regular dive into the media bullshit and reality around the issue of the Ukraine war. Because if you've been following the media twats in England and in the United States recently, I'm sure, and also like Germany and France, although I don't know what the French for media twat is, and you probably should find that out, you will be aware of the fact that there has been a very hard PR campaign going on behalf of the Ukrainian state by their usual supporters in Britain and elsewhere about how Ukraine is actually winning the war. This shouldn't be a surprise. They do this at least twice a year, usually when they want to justify an expansion of financial support, about how Ukraine strikes on Russian energy infrastructure and the Russian equivalent of Amazon has been shaking Putin to his very foundations, or making Putin look as if he's just eaten a bacon sandwich, as a Foreign Secretary Ed Miliband might say. But in reality, as Ukraine's defenders are now slowly admitting to, Ukraine's ability to actually fight this war has become more and more compromised as time has gone on. So that even now, even the defenders and the ardent enthusiasts for the so-called Ukrainian side, such as Owen Matthews here in The Spectator, whose article we have on screen, are admitting that there's now a severe problem for the Kiev regime, which is that they can no longer stop Russian missiles and drones. They don't have the air defense capacity. They don't have the ability to stop Russia firing on supply depots and targets of all kinds, which is, of course, a severe problem, given that for a long time, and in fact, I remember this from a couple of years ago, that you had like British officials running around and American officials running with them saying they were comprehensively rebuilding Ukrainian air defense. They will be flooded with patriots, that Trump announced recently, we're giving Ukraine the ability to make patriot missiles. You'll notice my impression of Trump is now constantly slurring and falling asleep. Watch his own press conferences. You'll know why I do that. But it would seem that all the attempts to flood Ukraine with Patriot missiles, with NASAMS, with other missile systems from the European members of NATO and from the United States, with Trump's promise to build Patriot missile systems in Ukraine itself, has all come to nothing. Like most of the announcements from like the NATO side about game changers. Remember all the game changers? Remember how HIMARS was going to win the war on its own? Didn't happen. Remember how providing a few, turns out, very dodgy, unreliable Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine resulted in a couple of them getting blown up, and then the British Ministry of Defence requesting that they no longer be deployed to the front line. Remember how the Abrams tank was going to storm through the Russian positions? Remember how the F-16s were going to change the war? As Paul Mason memorably tweeted in what can only be described as a fit of spice-addled delirium, F-16s, 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 F-16s. Paul must have been enjoying himself that weekend. And remember how all the Ukrainian counteroffensives, which you can see our past shows ad nauseum as analysing, but the fabled 2023 counteroffensive, remember that? How it ended, it started in the end of May 2023. It was going to storm through the Zaporozhye area. They were going to storm all the way to Crimea, just ended up with over 100,000 men dead. And all the Challengers, the Leopards, the Abrams tanks blown up in a Russian minefield, and they barely advanced. It was literally the scene from Blackadder season 4 where Stephen Fry's character says, here's the amount of ground we've recaptured since last week. What's the scale? 1 to 1, sir. It's literally a patch of dirt that they've dug up. That's the level of disaster that we're talking about here. Then, as Kit, you've covered before, there's the British organised disaster in Krinky. There's the utterly disastrous invasion of the Kursk region, which ended up with, again, tens and tens of thousands of Ukrainians being killed by, as it turned out, North Korean forces that had been brought in to defend Russian territory. All of these things were meant to turn the page, put Ukraine on the front foot, demonstrate our ironclad resolve, demonstrate the fact that everything was utterly futile and only led to hundreds of thousands of dead men. And now they're even admitting that the promises of the air defense have completely evaporated. So, Kit, any surprises in the admissions of Mr. Matthews, or are they merely catching up with the Decline and Fall show yet again?
Well, I mean, I think that Matthews is quite an interesting character, not because, he actually has anything interesting to say in and of itself, but you've got to bear in mind that he is a long-standing Maiden acolyte, dating back to, I think, that when it all kicked off in late 2013. And in June 2023, he published this book called Overreach, which is this bizarre pseudo-psychological account of why the special military operation happened. And he, of course, attributes its primary rationale to Putin's delusions of creating a modern-day hybrid of the Tsarist Empire and Soviet Union. And he concludes that Putin will leave no lasting ideological legacy. He has destroyed whatever prosperity and stability he delivered by his personal decision to wage illegal war on Ukraine. He has lost Russia's future. And then within 6 months of him writing this, he was writing for The Spectator about how Ukraine has already basically been partitioned and Ukraine is not getting what it's lost back. Right? So, ever since then, every so often, Matthews publishes pretty damning insights into the reality on the ground in Ukraine, which you're not going to get from the rest of the Spectator, let alone the rest of the mainstream media. And this essay that he's written, I mean, it's nothing that we haven't been saying for a very long time. Do check out our past episodes. I think that they very much stand the test of time, and offer insights which are as valuable today, if not more so, than they were at the time. But yeah, I mean, the reality is now, and I think unless you are a completely delusional, NAFO online troll activist, it cannot be denied that Ukraine is in very real trouble, and we've just seen a very clear demonstration of why the ever shrieking chorus of people who claim that Russia can't escalate and we should just go all in on this to win and finally crush the bear and break Russia up into little chunks is the fact that we've had 40 days of the supposed influence operation, which is going to show that the Ukrainians mean business and can win. And this has consisted of some pretty bold and destructive attacks on wild berries at department stores, etc. And Russia has responded by basically reducing Ukraine to a landlocked country. It has no viable ports. It cannot export anything via the sea anymore. It will never be able to again. And I think that points in the direction of Russia perhaps finally formally signaling that Odessa is on the menu. And I think for a lot of people this is long overdue, not least the strong pro-Russian contingent within Odessa itself. I have reported on leaked documents from 2022 where the SBU is talking about how we have a real problem that so many people in Odessa are going to be welcoming the Russians if and when they arrive. It's a matter of when now, not if, perhaps. But Ukraine is in very real trouble. I think Owen Matthews' op-ed was something of a trial balloon, normalizing the fact that even people who are deranged supporters of Zelensky and Ukraine are being honest about the fact that Kiev is in real trouble. And today, we had just before we went on air, Bloomberg published a kind of lengthy and quite detailed account of how effectively reiterating various things that Matthew said, but making the point that the maths just doesn't work. There are three kind of obvious outcomes for the war this year, which is that all of which effectively end in this carrying on going well into 2027. Ukraine has a very rough winter ahead of it. Its remaining population, those few men who have not been violently bundled into vans. I see that a new tactic is for Ukrainian military recruiters to start pepper spraying and subduing people before they're violently thrown into vans. So it's they're nothing if not ingenious in all of these methods that they're employing to get people who don't want to fight in a war to actually fight in it. Bloomberg notes as well that the Kremlin is in a position, no matter Ukraine's much vaunted long-range strike capability, that the Kremlin is now in a position to strike every inch of Ukraine it wishes without Ukraine being able to do very much about it. This could in itself herald, again, at long last, from the perspective of many people, precision strikes on Ukrainian cities. I don't think that the Kremlin will go in that direction, at least in terms of, striking civilian infrastructure or striking anything where there's a risk of significant civilian death. Again, civilian deaths in this conflict have been completely minuscule compared to pretty much any modern war, and of course especially the Gaza genocide and Israel's numerous wars of aggression against their neighbors in West Asia and indeed Iran. And we're not going to be seeing Russia deliberately striking schools in the manner of Minab in Iran. But yeah, like we talked a few weeks back about the Ankara summit, NATO's anniversary meeting in Turkey, which contained all sorts of bold. Concluded with all sorts of bold pronouncements and commitments to rearmament, to spending more on defense, to giving tens of billions of dollars to US arms manufacturers to ensure that Ukraine is equipped to keep fighting this. Well, I mean, that's great, but it depends on the US actually being able to provide what Ukraine desperately needs, and they literally can't. There was talk of Trump giving Ukraine the green light to start producing its own Patriot missiles. I would imagine that Russia would probably very quickly find where they're being produced if that ever happens, and take out the production site very, very, very quickly. So we are potentially heading into the end game here, although this could drag on quite a bit longer at completely senseless human and material cost. But yeah, I think we should certainly look to admissions such as Owen Matthews as indications of where we are in this conflict, when even the most unquestioning and fawning advocates of Kiev are sounding the alarm about very real and indeed irresolvable problems that Kiev is facing in fighting at all costs here.
And I wanted to add to that by just stating something which doesn't get said enough, even by those who are critical of the NATO side, which is, well, who is responsible primarily for the slaughter of the Ukrainian population? Because right now we're looking at a casualty figures for Ukraine of well over 1 million. So 1 million killed and severely wounded. We don't know the exact figures because nobody's counting, but we know that there are potentially hundreds of thousands also listed as missing, who have been listed as missing by Ukrainian unit commanders because they still want to get paid the money for the soldiers and don't want to admit that they're dead. So the casualties for this are astronomical. It should also be added that there's well over 100,000 Russians who have died. It's the heaviest casualty war for the Russian armed forces since the days of the Soviet Union and the Great Patriotic War. But Ukrainian society is being destroyed by this. So who is primarily responsible for this? And you have to say, first of all, the repulsive, disgusting, corrupt Ukrainian oligarchy that seized power in 1991 under completely fraudulent pretenses in a counter-revolution, who rigged elections all the way through the 90s to keep the Ukrainian Communist Party out of power, who built an oligarchic political system to serve their interests and asset strip and loot the country, sometimes leaning towards Russia, sometimes leaning towards the West, always looking for the best deal as to where to stash their money, and ultimately deciding that they could get a better deal out of the West, which is why you got the 2004 so-called Orange Revolution, backed up by the muscle of the Ukrainian fascists, sponsored, as we have discussed extensively in the past, by the CIA, by MI6, and by others in the Western intelligence services, supported enthusiastically by the late and unlamented Lindsey Graham and John McCain. And it is this combination of people, Ukrainian oligarchs, their fascist servants, Ukrainian liberals, who have got Ukrainian society in a death grip and have marched the Ukrainian working class off to die by the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, having rigged elections all the way through the 1990s. They then exploited Ukrainians' frustration at a system which was only delivering corruption and asset stripping by launching, first of all, the Orange Revolution, then the Maidan, claiming that they were taking Ukraine into a European future. No, they have taken it and turned it into a graveyard. They are no better than the wretched creatures like Stepan Bandera, Shoiskevich, and others from the 1940s, or Petlura from the 1900s, all of whom were vicious reactionary bastards, all of whom condemned Ukrainians to death by the thousands and thousands, and all of whom claimed when they were doing it that they were doing it for the glories of the Ukrainian nation. Well, the Ukrainian nation was never more of a nation than when it was in the Soviet Union. That's the reality. Every single time these pieces of shit get power, they sell the country to one imperial overlord or another and try and march the Ukrainian population off to death in service of that imperial power. This is what they're doing now. There is no hell that is cold enough or brutal enough for Zelensky, Kolomoisky, and all of the others to be cast into. These are the people who signed the Ukrainian nation's death warrants, along with their foreign sponsors, such as Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, Paul Mason, Chris Donnelly. Oh, and while we're at it, why don't we throw in most of the British left, Plaid Cymru and the SNP as well? All of these pieces of garbage are responsible for what's happened to Ukraine, and it is on them that the sins must be laid. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that particular rant, Kit.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, the cast of characters is very very long, and I will give a shout out to Moon of Alabama, who is a popular anon blogger who I called the Ukraine war very correctly from day one, was perhaps a bit too optimistic about a clean and rapid Russian victory, but was certainly, like his analysis of many things was completely contrary to what the Western media was saying, of course, were spot on. Now, Friedrich Merz is someone who Moon of Alabama, as a German citizen, absolutely despises. But Moon of Alabama said something very interesting at the start of the special military operation, which in specific response to Olaf Scholz, rather forgotten figure, who was chancellor for a few years. That Moon of Alabama made the point that all of these European leaders who are saying that we're going to make the ruble rubble, we're going to collapse the Russian economy, we're going to and Scholz was talking about Zeitenwende, this huge shift where Russia was going to be completely cut off from Europe, and that Germany was going to start rearming to face the massive threat of Russia, etc. Moon of Alabama predicted that a lot of these politicians wouldn't be in office very long, actually, in attempting to do what they were claiming they were going to do, and indeed in doing what they were doing, particularly in respect of the sanctions. Well, Scholz has gone, and left office as the least popular chancellor in Germany's history, and was replaced by Friedrich Merz, of course, who very, very quickly, before even being formally sworn in as chancellor, he pulled off a very, very, very sly coup, where he got enhanced military spending passed and restrictions on state spending on all sorts of things lifted, using the pre-election parliament to push this through, which he wouldn't have been able to do under his own government, as it were, under the composition of parliament produced by the election that he won. And this was deeply unpopular. He's lurched from deeply unpopular to, again, the most unpopular German chancellor in history in the span of just over a year. A spectacular showing that I think even Keir Starmer would be jealous of at this stage. And now there is muttering that he might be removed because he's so unpopular. I think that he's polling at about 13% or something like completely insane. And there is, there was a mass cabinet reshuffle because his ministers were openly criticizing him and suggesting that he was behaving like a total lunatic and autocrat. And that was badly handled by him in the manner of everything that he's ever done. There are members of his own party prominent members of his own party, the kind of far right Christian Democratic Union, who want him gone. AFD is looking at outright victory in a number of regional elections, etc. And it's like, yeah, all of the I think, as we've discussed in some detail about Starmer, is what these politicians are attempting to do is effectively impossible, and they are trying to militarize societies in ways that citizens are not ready for and don't want. They are edging closer towards conscription, which I mean would be a disaster from every angle if it was implemented. And indeed would be massively unpopular. It was not long ago that the German military announced that it was going to impose restrictions on the ability of German men to leave the country for extended periods, and that if not enough people voluntarily enlisted in the military, then they would be press ganged into it. They backtracked from that due to mass outcry, but that's still probably on the table, no doubt. So it's like there's an attempt to remilitarize Germany, which many countries in Europe understandably don't want. Many countries in the world are opposed to. Much of the German public, as Zionist as they might be, as pro-Ukraine as they might be, don't want either. And efforts to rejig Germany's economy from an industrial manufacturing powerhouse made decrepit by self-destructive sanctions on Russian energy. There have been attempts to shift this to defense production, etc. There have been some developments in that regard, but again, without cheap Russian oil and gas, it's going to be completely impossible. But because, for reasons unclear, that there is a seeming Europe-wide obsession with getting into a direct conflict with Russia, and German military officials have openly stated they are already ready to do that. I mean, hilarious. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so apocalyptically bleak. So yeah, the European, Western elites, particularly in decrepit Europe, they painted themselves into a corner. They have made all sorts of undertakings, both publicly and surely in private, with their actual controllers in Washington, maybe even in London as well, that they're going to do all of this stuff, which is going to be difficult, if not impossible, and suicidally unpopular. But they're going to go ahead and do it anyway, or at least try to. And MERS is just the latest victim of this. It's not clear who or what might replace him. AFD is being talked up as a massive threat, and there is open talk of engaging in formal and less formal means to sabotage them and prevent them from prevent them from taking power in Germany's federal regions, which again is going to be deeply unpopular. And again, this comes at a time when the EU is pulling off outright coups, whether that's in Romania or Hungary, which is creating a lot of anger towards the greater EU project and demonstrating European values to be the self-serving fiction they always were. So I mean, perhaps now is the time to start betting on how much longer Friedrich Merz has left.
I would say less than 6 months, judging from his disastrous showing so far. And I would also add that Andy Burnham probably has less than 18 months, because, again, he's going to try and do similar things to Keir Starmer that Keir Starmer was supposedly there to do but was unable to do. So things that Rishi Sunak wanted to do but was unable to do. Things that Boris Johnson wanted to do but was unable to do. And that is, like, you can't militarize a country. Okay, I know I keep repeating this, but it bears repeating, with no industrial base. Now, Germany has more of an industrial base than Britain, but then again, that wouldn't be hard. There are small islands populated only by puffins in the North Sea with a better industrial base than Britain. But again, you can't just repurpose a car industry into an armaments industry. You can do it if you've got some kind of plan. But again, Germany has historically lacked for fuel resources. It's one of the problems that confronted both the Kaiser and the Nazis. The reason why they needed to control Romania. They wanted to drive through the Soviet Union into the Caucasus to seize the Soviet oil fields. They don't have a lot of natural resources in the borders of Germany itself. That presents a problem. You can't have mass armaments industries powered by fucking solar panels or windmills. Doesn't work. And again, like you're confronted with the fact that like these late stage imperial core nations lacked not only the industrial capacity but the organizational and institutional capacity to actually rebuild anything. And so, like, what you get is this endless stream of PR announcements and manipulations and stunts involving, like, Keir Starmer or wearing a flak jacket and strutting about as if he's, like, on the deck of, like, some aircraft carrier in World War II, and then quietly announcing that his 3% GDP spending target for defense isn't going to be met. The same thing's going to happen to Andy Burnham. Same thing's going to happen to fucking John Healey, because he's mad militarist bastard who's now in charge of the Treasury. What's going to happen is they're going to be confronted with certain realities, which is Healey, to fund the war budget, will call for cuts elsewhere. Labour's popularity will fucking tank. The Labour MPs facing defeat in an upcoming general election will panic. God knows what's going to replace them, because it seems like Nigel Farage is busily committing political suicide at the moment. Perhaps more on that in future episodes. But they'll all panic and they'll threaten to overthrow Burnham. Burnham will be told by the military establishment, you must press forward. He'll end up losing the election, and then the whole process will continue again until, of course, this pattern is broken, and it can only be broken by the fiction being called out for what it is, which is that somebody needs to step forward and say, not only is it the case that the Russian threat to Europe does not exist. It doesn't exist when it applies to Germany. It doesn't exist when it applies to France. It doesn't exist when it applies to fucking perfidious Albion or Scotland or wherever. It's a lie. And just to take this full circle, Kit, you were talking about how the intelligence services in the 90s manufactured the animal rights movement as a threat to security, which wasn't real. The same is true on a massive case, in the massive case of Russia. It's a huge country with significant resources, a significant industrial base. But as we've covered before, it's a country which has a military doctrine based on the defense of its own territory, not the acquisition of others. It's why the war's taken so long, partly anyway. But this isn't the Tsar's army of 1820. This isn't this isn't the Soviet Union. It is an unambitious Russian ruling class that simply wants to exploit resources and asset strip its own country. They have no desire for conquests in the east of Europe. It doesn't exist. This threat is not real. And the thing is, people in the political establishment know it's not real. Occasionally, one of them will utter something critical and then be slapped down by a media campaign featuring everybody from the Daily Telegraph to the Guardian. Like recently, Diane Abbott, who's been let back into the Labour Party again, there ran some scare stories about her saying critical things about the Ukraine war. But again, like, people know the truth that this is manufactured, but nobody will stand up and say in Britain or anywhere else, like, this is fake. The people who make up this stuff, who run with it, like the media twats and the Daily Telegraph, are lying. The generals who go on TV to claim the great threat from Russia are lying, and in some cases, like in the case of Lord Dannatt, have a very extensive share portfolio that would benefit from remilitarization. That the intelligence services are trying to justify their own existence. That the City of London is the predator that wants to go off and loot the carcass of Russia if they could deliver a win. And all of this there's nothing to gain to the ordinary person in perfidious Albion or France or Germany or the United States from this war continuing. And the reason why the AfD or Georgescu in Romania get any popularity at all is because they say some of these things. Now, they would not actually implement their programs for a minute. They would immediately capitulate if they got into power, just like Georgia Maloney did, just like Le Pen will do, and adopt the same agenda of their predecessors. But the fact that they are at least prepared to say some critical things is the reason why they become popular. And the fact that all of the so-called fucking social democratic parties and left organizations won't go near any of this, including in this country, in Scotland, you have the SNP bellowing and screaming for British remilitarization because of the threat of Russia. What threat does Russia pose to Scotland, Mr. Stephen Flynn? I would ask you, if you bothered to reply to any of your tweets from many Scots asking you that question, why are you so pro-NATO? Do you believe that the British are going to give you independence if you agree to sign Scots up to a NATO war on Russia? Because not a lot of people want that action. So this fakery, this nonsense, this mirage needs to be dispelled. And it's only going to be dispelled in the end by a reinvigorated working class movement. The right wingers, like the AFD, who at the moment are gaining popularity by demagogically stating some of these truths, they will not do it. They will capitulate to the establishment. Again, to go back to the point about the spy cops, why do they not infiltrate right-wing organizations? Because right-wing organizations are no threat to the state, even if they will periodically make points that resonate with people. They will never go against the ruling class because that's who their patrons are. And I will conclude my comments there and ask Kit if you want to come in with anything further to draw the show to a conclusion.
Well, not especially. I mean, I do think it is worth just reflecting as well on the fact that it's summer and it's the silly season, and it's also a great time to be burying bad news. And I mean, it can be quite difficult to parse PARSE what is going on. What the hell is going on in West Asia right now, particularly in regard to the Zionist American war on Iran. I mean, in the spirit of victory laps and patting ourselves on the back, we did tell you back in February when this horror erupted that it was going to result in US defeat, and a particularly crushing one way or another. And it seems that we've reached that point. It was reported in CNN that the Trump administration was trying to shake down the Pentagon and the CIA and other wings of the US national security state, seeing if they had any ideas at all for tipping the balance of power in the US's favor again. The total lack of follow up on that story suggests that either the recipients of this urgent message were on holiday, or they have absolutely nothing to contribute. And so, I mean, on top of the missile stockpile issue, which not only affects Ukraine but also the US's ability to pointlessly pound faraway countries and kill multiple civilians in the process. The fact of the matter is that the mainstream media is acknowledging that that the future of US bases in West Asia is, to say the least, highly questionable. And this was something that Alex and I discussed on a podcast together all of yesterday. But it does, I think, at the risk of repeating ourselves, bear repeating that the US is in a position where it could and potentially will leave these bases very abruptly and perhaps without much warning, in the hope that their hurried escape will just be forgotten about in the manner of Afghanistan. Like, this could very plausibly happen, and when that happens, it's not only other imperial powers like Britain and France and Germany, or the EU, which are in very serious trouble in West Asia, but it's also all of the puppet regimes which have been kept in power by A, US military occupation, and B, brutal British and American trained internal security, military, and police forces. And this is, while the media is acknowledging that these governments are in real trouble, what comes next is not really being talked about, because from the US's perspective, there is no next, because they don't really care. And I think that with the increasing focus on, in terms of US rhetoric, about broadening the quote unquote war on drugs to include in-country strikes, in places like Mexico, but also Nicaragua and other areas of the America's southern hemisphere. That the US could very sharply and abruptly pivot to its own backyard. This has long been a very real prospect, which a lot of people, including anti-imperialists, be they activists or journalists, aren't really thinking about very seriously. Now, all of a week ago, this was news which was quite shocking to me, but didn't really register on the mainstream radar. It was reported in the New York Times that hundreds of Jordanian political figures and activists and civil people within civil society signed an open letter openly calling for the end of US military presence in Jordan. Jordan's a country that we've discussed, across various different episodes. To say the least, the Gaza genocide basically put Jordan's ruling dynasty created by the British and currently a throne occupied by a British Army veteran on notice, because a significant proportion, if not the majority, of Jordan's population are themselves Palestinian. They, in many cases, are people who fled the 1948 Nakba and their progeny. And the Jordanian government responded to the outbreak of the Gaza genocide by trying to legalize Palestine solidarity and resistance locally, which was as popular as you can imagine. And this included banning displays of the Palestinian flag. It included using British supplied technological spying capabilities to try and break into the phones and computers of often entirely peaceful activists who were just trying to arrange demonstrations and protests and leafleting events, etc. They tried to effectively create a bunkered state of siege and lockdown to crack down on Palestine solidarity. It's not gone very well. And the fact, and this is a country where you can go to jail for social media posts, and criticizing the king is you can get several years in jail for doing so. This is pretty significant. And it shows that people are increasingly less afraid of the consequences of stepping out of line, and increasing cognizance, that there's more of us than there are you. If the US was to leave, that's Jordan ceasing to exist as a political entity pretty much overnight, I would suggest. And it raises all sorts of questions about the balance of power in wider West Asia, which are not being addressed. I think that people like MI6 are almost certainly just hoping against hope that by ignoring the problem it will just go away. No, it isn't. This is potentially a long-term process in terms of, US bases are already on fire throughout the region, and are going to take years to repair, if they're even repairable at all. This is cause for optimism. I think that now is the time to start thinking about a US-less future, not only in individual states within West Asia, but potentially the wider region, and also a US-less future in places in parts of Europe where US occupation is absolutely fundamental to sustaining unsustainable protectorates, such as in Bosnia, etc. People need to start thinking about what happens next now, and doing so in a constructive way, because the writing is very much on the wall, and the long-term inevitability is the US leaving. In the meantime, bad faith actors like Britain are going to be engaging in skullduggery and scheming what they can do to try and maintain the US presence. So, that's something to look out for, something to be ever vigilant about, and also something that people should be working to expose to the extent that they can. But yeah, let's start thinking constructively about what a US-less future for West Asia and other regions looks like, because it is within grasp now, believe me.
Well, it probably looks like a future without imperialism, because the entire imperialist bloc is dependent upon, and has been dependent upon, the US to be the muscle behind it for many years. And as we've just been discussing with reference to the failures of Friedrich Merz and others, the Europeans can't do it anymore. The Europeans can't do the kind of level of like aggressive militarism that they were capable of like 50, 60 years ago or 100 years ago. And without the US to underpin the system in West Asia, that's the curtains for the Jordanian regime, the Saudi regime, the Gulf states, and any other, and of course the MI6 sponsored regime in Damascus as well, and the Comprador Lebanese government. Like, all of these are underpinned by principally like the US, the British, the French, and others. If their presence diminishes or goes entirely, then you're going to be faced with something which is a fundamentally much more unstable scenario for a while. It will also mean, by the way, curtains for the Zionist regime, because well, if you notice, one of the things that the US has been doing recently, they've been integrating the Israeli armed forces into their own armed forces. Now, this has been misunderstood by some as like, oh my God, Israel's taking command of the US's armed forces. It's the other way around. The US is taking direct charge of like Israeli armed forces, because essentially they're having to take more and more direct control over Israel itself, because Israel itself is becoming more and more unstable and unreliable as an asset. So this is a crucial time. It is a time when we could face, in short order, the disintegration of the current system. And you need to start all of us need to start thinking seriously about, well, what actually happens after that? Because the entire system in the West is based on rinsing money out of the areas of the world that used to be referred to as the third world or the developing world or the global south. Basically, then the world that gets reduced to neo-colonial exploitation, if all of that disappears, then the productive bases of Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Portugal don't exist. So what happens next? That's the interesting question, which not a lot of people actually want to answer. But we here at Decline and Fall will endeavour to deliver certain answers to you, and you can keep an eye firmly on our various channels over the next few months for more and more detailed coverage of the decline and fall of the ever perfidious Anglo-American Empire. This has been a very good show. We are being currently watched by over 600 of you on various different platforms, all very good. You can expect various clips from this show to arrive via Substack and YouTube over the next few days. And be sure to like, share, and subscribe to all platforms that we are available on. Many more things to come in terms of interviews and specials, including an upcoming discussion with Professor David Miller regarding his very important employment tribunal case and other things. But until next time, I've been Alexander Mackay in an undisclosed location in Glasgow.
And I've been Kit Klarenberg in an undisclosed location in the once and future socialist Yugoslavia. Take care, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in.